Good afternoon, everyone. We have a great group that is gathering for this very, very important NACD program. I'm Beth Boland. I am the chair of the New England chapter, and we are so pleased to have you all join us for board oversight in building a resilient corporate culture, which could not be more timely than it is right now. And we'll get to that in just a moment. Before we get to that, though, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. First of all, please everybody mute yourselves. We have a lot of people on the call and we want to make sure that our speakers are heard. You can put your questions in the chat function, but also we find that having such a great group of attendees means that they have great comments in addition to questions. So feel free to put your comments in the chat function as well. For those of you who need credits, make sure that your name is on your attendee block so that we can give you due credit. And we want to let everybody know and just confirm that the panelists and moderator statements and opinions are their own and not the companies with which they work. So we also want to acknowledge our chapter sponsors. There we are. Great screen. We have great sponsors in the New England chapter. And during this time, I do want to take just a moment to recognize the turmoil that many of our boards, our companies are in as we go through this last week of many, many changes. Many of these chapter partners and our sponsors have portals that help boards navigate through this time of very, very intense change. So please feel free to visit those because there's a lot of great information out there that can be of interest to our attendees. I want to spotlight in particular Egon Zender, which has been a chapter sponsor for many, many years, fantastic partner on the corporate governance and board searches side. And we thank you for all of your service to the New England chapter for so many years. So now let's turn to the program. It is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Barbara Duganier, who is with us from the Texas Tri-Cities chapter and is a fantastic moderator and is very, very adept on the issues that we'll be addressing today. She has 35 years of executive experience in leadership positions at Arthur Andersen and Accenture, plus over a decade of board service. She sits on a number of public and private company boards, primarily in the energy sector, and she is NACD Directorship certified. So with that, I'll turn it over to Barbara, and our esteemed panelists will have a great program today, I'm sure.
Thanks, Beth, and thanks to the New England chapter for having me here. I'm excited to moderate today and to first initially introduce these esteemed program panelists. Today we have speakers who are distinguished in multiple industries and board experience, and they're going to share their thoughts on this very key topic of culture and building a resilient culture. Steve Jennings has over 30 years of experience advising C-suite executives and boards and is currently the lead independent director and chair of the governance committee of Analog Devices, Inc., a global semiconductor company. Fred Lowry is an accomplished and dynamic corporate leader with over 25 years of experience. He's currently the executive vice president and president, laboratory products and bioproduction of Thermo Fisher Scientific. He's a board member of DuPont, where he chairs the People and Compensation Committee and is also on the board of directors at the Boston Medical Center. And then Jill Smith brings nearly 20 years of experience as a CEO of public and private technology companies. She spent over a decade on the boards of public, private, and family-owned businesses and served as board chair as well as chair of all the core committees. She currently serves on the board of Checkpoint Software and MDA Space. Welcome, Steve. Fred, and Jill. Let me give you my thoughts to start on culture, and then we'll dig right into questions with the panelists. As Beth mentioned in the lead-in, please put your comments in the chat. This is enriched by your thoughts and your questions, so we'd love to hear from you. We'll take various pauses during the program to be able to deal with those questions. I know for a fact with this group, we won't be able to deal with all of them, but nonetheless, we'll get a feel for what your thoughts and where you want to take this. Culture has been described as the sum of the shared values, assumptions, and beliefs that create the unique character of an organization. It's also been referred to as the tone at the top, the mood in the middle, and the buzz at the bottom. We know from our own experience that culture is very company specific. It's really like the DNA of any company. For global companies, we also know that culture can be quite different in geographies around the world. The values and purpose of a company can be the what and the why, whereas the culture is the how, or the way in which the values and purpose are lived every day by the employees. To be a strong, positive, sustainable culture, it must align with the company's purpose, its values, its strategy, and its business model. If those items are right, they provide glue for a positive culture. Culture reaches beyond the company since it relates to not only how employees are treated, but how customers, suppliers, communities, and external stakeholders are also treated. Culture can be a strategic asset, but as we know, bad culture can also destroy enterprise value and create reputational risk. We also know that there are 3 different levels of culture. There's the surface culture, which is very visible behaviors. Below the surface is the unspoken culture, which relates to norms such as the unspoken rules and the informal interactions and the routines and the rituals. And the deep, deep culture, which is the subconscious and gets to what we actually say and what we actually do and values that are important to all of us. Often when a company is in crisis, its deep culture is what is most visible. We've also heard about different hallmarks of different types of cultures. There's safety cultures, must create the right tone at the top and policies, procedures, and training so that safety is integral to how employees work and live. An innovation culture must sustain its commitment to reimagine its processes and reinvent its products and services in response to market need. And an agile, resilient culture must encourage focused discipline and process that leads to market opportunities and emerging risks and adapt. We'll explore today how boards can understand more about the deep culture of the companies they serve, particularly related to their resilience, understand how to recognize and measure that resilience, and adopt behaviors in the boardroom which reflect the right tone at the top of a resilient culture. So without further ado, I'd like to hear from our panelists. We're going to go again with some prepared questions, and then again, we'd love to hear from you, so please put those questions in the chat. So to my panelists, let's start off more broadly on culture. Although cultures are unique to each company, we've all seen very visible examples in the press of where cultures that have gone awry have created unwanted outcomes. Just to name a few, from a sales perspective, Wells Fargo, safety, Boeing, ethics in its admissions, Volkswagen. Certain tech companies and tech industry have been noted as lack of inclusion and diversity in the workforce, harassment, et cetera. We can often see clearly when cultures turn unhealthy, but from each of your experiences, what are the key characteristics you look for in a healthy culture? And Steve, I'm going to start with you.
Thanks, Barbara, and thanks everyone for joining today. So, I've had the privilege of serving on a bunch of different boards over the course of my career, and there are kind of 2 cultural things I think are interesting. On the tech companies, for example, a sort of relentless focus on the clarity and the truth and innovation. So up and down the cycles, tech companies suffer such complicated the cycles like we're in right now, and a willingness, even things are very difficult, to continue to invest in R&D, but also being willing to turn things off, make decisions. So really strong cultures do that in the tech space. And in the professional services space, where I was also had a chance to serve on boards, the commitment to clients. It's not just to profits, not just to growing the business, but particularly when things get very complicated, does the culture respond with how are we going to serve our clients better, not how we're going to take care of ourselves? Those are signs of a culture that's got the fundamentals from top to bottom in the relevant businesses. And I'm sure, Fred, you'll have ideas from other industries as well, where the kinds of things that really show up and down, particularly when things are difficult.
Thanks, Steve. Fred, I'll go to you next.
Yeah.
Same question.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to the discussion today. And my experience would say that the culture is, especially as a board member, really starts for me looking at the CEO and the senior leadership and what do they exhibit as in their behaviors. And I'm looking for behaviors like transparency and accountability. And I actually think that also you can see that from the board. I mean, if the board has really good governance, it's a good sign that good governance really drives down into the culture. But I also think it's about having the right balance between short-term gains and having a real clear view of what the long-term strategy is of the business, and making sure that you're making that the management team's making decisions related to the long term and driving value, whether it is an innovation company or a customer-focused company or a company that's more focused on optimization. But I think it really centers around what are the values that company really is focused on. And as I think about DuPont, the DuPont values are safety and respect for people and environmental responsibility and ethics. And then I look at the board committees. We have a safety and environmental committee. So it should flow. It all should make sense around what the culture is, around what are we measuring and what are we spending our time on as a board talking about. And is that coming through from the senior leadership team?
Great. Thanks, Fred. And Jill, your thoughts?
Yeah, first to reinforce, Steve, your point around industry is absolutely going to value, the importance of culture is prevalent across every industry, every company, but some cultures won't fit certain industry. If you're not innovative in the tech space, if you're not resilient because change is every day, it ain't going to happen. You're not going to be successful. So I think as we understand cultures, fit really matters. And I know we'll talk about M&A and business transformation. The hardest thing is yesterday my culture was perfectly suited to the industrial space or to the services business. And then once you overlay digitization and technology, that's where the clash and the cultures can come. And I think we will spend some more time on that. So really understanding the suitability in some ways of our core culture to not just where we are today, but where we are going is going to really matter. Fred, I'd add to, you mentioned accountability. I think absolutely does everybody own the outcome, or are they pointing at somebody else? Is one of those signs that you can see even in the boardroom, although culture, the information around culture comes outside the boardroom, I think. Transparency, being willing to admit mistakes, willing to own the problems, absolutely you can see in the boardroom and outside. And I would add sort of consistency, in the way that I see consistency happen is, the leadership team, the CEO and those reporting to him using the same language, or when one of them gets off, they lead with nothing but the numbers, whereas the next person steps up and leads with is a really strong, deep culture, Barbara, as you articulated, is one where we all speak the same language. And then however we're presenting, whether we're presenting an update on the quarter or whether we're talking about a strategy, the elements are there throughout. And so I'm also looking for that language commonality that comes through.
Can I add something to that? I think this point
Of
around
course, yeah.
this point around consistency is really brilliant, because when things go wrong, or when the outside forces change, are you really grounded on what makes you who you are? That to me does really describe a strong culture, and you're able to continue to use the same language and focus on the right things longer term, but also deal with the realities of whatever the environment might be. I think that's a really great point, Jim.
Yeah, and Fred, you had
Yeah,
mentioned resilience, and a key to being a resilient culture is consistency. Because when
well,
it
let's,
gets really stressful, if you're
yeah.
not consistent, then it's really hard to hold the line. And we've seen a lot of stress in the last decade or so.
Yeah, no, Steve, I think that's a great segue into the next. I was just going to say to this point too of consistency, we've seen so many examples over time where companies blow in the wind. It's the thing to do, and then they do it, and then when it's not the thing to do, it quickly changes. So let's talk about that resilience. I think Steve, you were headed there. I want to do a deeper dive into some of those same characteristics you mentioned, because I think there's overlap, right? As you guys were explaining what you thought were healthy culture. But what do you think are the key things that hallmark a resilient culture? And this time I'm going to start, Fred, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, I'll start where we just kind of ended. I think resiliency is about the ability to adapt, recover, and thrive in the face of whatever the external challenge might be. It starts for me with having a strong sense of purpose, really being purpose driven and understanding what that is, which could be different depending on the type of company or the company, but a clear direction that goes along with that, and the ability to embrace change. And I would go further to say the commitment to continuously improve. So whatever the environment is, we're going to continuously improve. I think that drives a level of resilience that says less about what's happening external and more about how we react to it. That we're going to continuously improve in the environment that we're in. And I think what you don't find in those cultures, you don't find a culture of fear. I think fear is a real detractor when you're trying to be resilient, because you may be stuck and not be willing to take the appropriate risk and appear to be rigid. I think a culture where communication or where there's a lack of transparency, really fights against being able to react and be resilient in that regard. I think you need a culture where there's a level of psychological safety around the truth, because ultimately that's what you need to understand in these stressful and dynamic situations. I think it also, kind of speaks to a culture where you value the talent that's in the organization. And if you don't value the talent, I think that becomes more difficult for people to thrive in the face of challenges. And I think that really impacts resilience. So that's how I think about cultures, or the kind of characteristics I think about cultures that really thrive from a resilience standpoint.
Great. Thanks, Fred. Jill, I'm going to go to you next.
Yeah, I love your points, Fred, and I think this sort of the resilience is sort of inextricably linked with change, and it is both how do we anticipate it and how do we respond. And so from both a formal as well as a sort of a cultural perspective, readiness for change, I think, is inherent in resilience. There are lots of ways to do it. But, certainly when, most of us have seen friction from, cultural clashes, from the wrong culture at the wrong time. And so I might just overlay on top of that the imperative, whatever your culture is, for it to be supported by, first of all, let's call it, never be afraid to hide behind. So let's own the culture that we have, but recognize that we need to anticipate what's happening. So how well are we talking about our readiness for change? How well are we planning for a range of alternatives? Because a rigid culture, by contrast to a resilient, agile culture, says we're great, we've just got to keep doing what we're doing. And a resilient culture says, let's plan, let's understand all the things that can go wrong. So this overlaying of formal planning, really thinking things through is an inherent output of a resilient culture, because you're willing to acknowledge what needs to change.
That's great. Anticipating the change, planning for it, and understanding the extent, the impact it'll have on the company. That's a great point. Steve, any additional thoughts? I know you were headed there first.
Yeah, the only thing, so, we've all heard the acronym VUCA, the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. It's real. And human organizations don't like change. Human beings basically don't like change. So the point Jill's making is, I think, incredibly accurate, which is particularly in industry, is any kind of tech industry or rapid change industry, consumer business where consumer behaviors are changing. Building in a system where we expect things to be moving all the time is the key. And the companies that get caught are the ones, it goes back to Clay Christensen's, the innovator's dilemma and this sort of thing. People getting dug in on a way to do things. I think certainly the geopolitical and broadly political environment around the world today, the companies who do the, crossing the stream by feeling the stones. So they're working their way through and they're not assuming they know the path, and celebrate that internally, and they talk about it and admit that they don't have all the answers, are the ones that are most successful in an environment like this.
Yeah, that's great. I want to dig a little bit then into when culture changes and some of how resilience is tested. We all, I think, on this call lived through COVID. It's interesting. During COVID is when, in my experience, people started talking the most about resilience and resilience in culture. Even institutional investors and analysts started saying, well, this company, how do you measure its resilience? And a lot of them look to that. But clearly we know that's a bit in our rearview mirror, hopefully for a long time to come. And there are great examples and great tests when that resilience can be shaken. A couple of those might be, and I know this panel will have their thoughts about when they've seen it change, but could be you have a change in CEO, tone at the top, right? CEO transition, significant M&A can kind of change the culture or strike a change in the culture, something to watch out for. Or even when there's a RIF, when there's a big workforce reduction or something major, a shock to the company system. So I'll ask you guys as a board member, what are some examples? What are some stories? What sort of wisdom do you have from a board perspective of when you've seen shifts in the culture, and what directors should kind of watch out for during those trying times? And Jill, I'll start with you.
Certainly. Now,
Yeah.
just to sort of draw a line under the sort of the COVID definition of resilience, that often referred to, does the culture stick, and or can we perpetuate it if everybody's not in the office? There are all sorts of supply chain disruptions, and that's just a day in the life of a company or a board where something changes. But this notion of culture being sort of tied to presence, the CEO's presence, management's presence, et cetera, I think is a sort of is now normalized, as we now need to ensure that culture is enacted through and is can be supported by a remote workforce. And so that has its own challenges without the same touch points. But I think that's now in many ways been normalized. But Barbara, you sort of highlighted the ones that stand out for me as being the times where, as you said at the beginning, the water level is lowered, and now you see really the culture of the company. It's sort of CEO transition, executive hiring. You can have the world's best candidate in terms of qualifications, experience, alignment with future strategy, but if he or she doesn't fit, and then that's the whole question of, is fit a good thing or a bad thing, depending on where you go. But the cultural clash can spit out really qualified leaders, to say nothing sort of the employees underneath them. And the flip side is therefore one needs to be able to describe and articulate the culture in order to be able to test any employee as they enter the company, but particularly the CEO and executive management. M&A or strategic transformation. And, I've lived through many, and the ones that stand out, in the tech world, Steve, you'll doubtless be able to speak about this in spades, is hardware, software. We all know that intrinsically, again, to the extent to which cultures aligned with industry, what makes hardware companies great may not be what makes a resilient culture in a software company. People businesses versus technology business, and many services businesses are trying to digitize, let's not even go to AI. But then how do you command equivalent respect across both of those workforces? How do you create a common culture? And certainly there are some lessons learned as to how to do it. But that clash of cultures, for me, has been most evident in those two cases. There are many others, but I'd love to hear Steve's and Fred's experience and perspective.
Yeah.
So Fred, go ahead.
I'm happy to jump in. I think of it, there's two kind of types of interruptions. There's the thing that you plan for, CEO succession, M&A, divestitures, et cetera, where you're like, this is going to happen. We know it's going to happen. We have an idea, and we've put together, some change management elements. And I think in those cases, you need to execute well and measure quick, have a good measurement system in place so that you can react and change and manage your way through these things and provide the appropriate support. But then there's these things like COVID, a cyber event, or these things that happen that you weren't expecting. They could happen, but they're probably on your risk assessment as a board. But when they actually do happen, you have to be prepared for those. So I do think having the conversation and doing desktops and those types of things, and thinking about the elements of culture when you do that, not just the specific actions you're going to take, but how is this going to impact people? What do we expect people to do when these things happen, and make sure that you've incorporated that into your planning cycle. I think that's really super important. But I also believe you have to empower people to make decisions, but also know that it's not going to be perfect. That when you're in the crisis or when you're going through a change, it's not gonna happen exactly the way you expect, and you have to be able to recalibrate in those situations, and where you have a real strong sense of who you are, the culture. I think it allows you to make mistakes and continues to improve from that point. So that's how I think about it in this context.
Steve, any additional thoughts?
Fred and Jill hit, I think, the critical categories. I was on a board where we not only had the wonder of the CEO transition, but choosing a CEO and then having the CEO be disqualified and having to fire the CEO and having that whole thing. And you can see when that sort of thing happens, it's like, oh boy, now we're off to the races, right? I do think one of the questions you asked, Barbara, was as a board, how do we think about this, and when this is occurring, when you've got these big transitions, what are you looking for the consistency of culture? And I think you can go back to, in some ways, your first question: are we getting consistent communications that reflect the values and the things that we believe the company is supposed to be about? Is it retaining key employees? Are we making important customer decisions? So for example, many of the technology companies during COVID made sure that the technology went to medical products for taking care of people. And so they prioritized that relative to getting a new toaster or something, right? So you can start to see, you have to start to have these sort of intermediate metrics, which hopefully, as Fred was saying, you've given some thought to, because you spent some time thinking about the resilience planning. You've got a risk profile, you've got your protocols for something problematic happens. How does the management team respond? How does the board respond? But particularly if it's an extended crisis, whether it's COVID or seems like a long time ago now, but the 08, 09, 010 crisis, the financial crisis, that they don't tend to resolve themselves quickly. So you are looking for, as a board, is the management team responding in a consistent manner? Is it paying attention to the employees? Is it getting the messages out consistent with the culture and the values that we express as a company?
You mentioned something key, and I want to say I'm going to dig one more question on this, but I've seen tons of questions coming in. So I'm going to take a bit of a read after this because I want to make sure we get time to answer some of those. So Steve, you mentioned metrics. So how does a group feel about being able to have specific metrics that measure resilience and maybe pick a couple areas, whether that be with people, whether that be with suppliers, whether that be with customers, whether that be in innovation, or is it just a sense that you get? I mean, because of some of those other things, like Jill was mentioning consistency, and, obviously Fred mentioned values. And so what do you think about what are some of those, if they are specific metrics where the board can say, yeah, I'm getting a sense this is embedded in the culture and this is a resilient company?
So I'll pick up just where I left. So the way I think of it, you've got a set of input metrics in my mind, and you've got a set of output metrics. So the input metrics are things like the quality of the communications, the taking care of people, the visible symbols that the company's responding appropriately to, particularly to any kind of crisis. The output metrics will tend to be on the other side. Right. Did we continue to invest in the downturn if we're a technology company? Did we retain key customers? Did we retain key employees? Did we even take share? The never waste a good crisis, the overused phrase. So I think you can look at both ends of this as a board. I think I have not seen setting up specific resilience criteria so much as saying that the resilience should be embedded in what we're doing, embedded in our culture, and therefore if we're putting the right stuff in at the front end, the right stuff should be coming out the back end. But
Yeah.
Joe, I don't. You may have seen other situations.
Well,
Yeah.
I'll jump in. I think whenever you see a major change in any performance metric, it's a great question. It's a great time to check.
Yeah.
The oil, so to speak, is going, well, wait a minute. we were here, we've seen a major change. Let's understand what's driving it. But I also think there are leading indicators, and I think in my experience, we look at things like the survey results that we get every year in the case of DuPont and Thermo Fisher, and saying, hey, has anything changed? What are we hearing from our colleagues? I think the retention metrics, I think, are really good signs, and people certainly vote with their feet. And I think the how people describe their relationships with their managers is a very, very telling sign of what the culture really is, and that comes out in our case through surveys. So I think that's a great place to look.
I don't have, metrics to add. I think those that you've highlighted, Fred and Steve, are absolutely spot on. I would just use this as an opportunity to remind ourselves of one of the primary responsibilities of the board, and it is, sort of the responsibility for the CEO. And so I think it's a terrific opportunity for a board to be able to have the data, understand what may be missing or otherwise in the culture, and to set that as one of the CEO's responsibilities. And so if you're seeing, a lack of accountability, how do you translate that into an expectation of our CEO? If we are seeing that it's performance over people, and it's turning we're seeing therefore poor scores and or turnover. How do we turn that into the responsibility in terms of the performance requirements? So start to put sort of money where your mouth is in terms of, if the board cares about culture, it's watching the inputs and outputs, it's watching the lead indicators, the lagging indicators, but now what are we going to do about it? And I think it lays then at the feet of the CEO as to how important that needs to be.
Yeah, Jill, as you were talking, I was seeing in my head that performance scorecard for CEOs. Yep. And the mix of the qualitative and the quantitative, but being very specific what we're talking about in terms of developing a better culture, if that's one of the issues the board identifies. Okay, so Ellen, you've been waiting in the wings there. I know there's a lot of questions. Maybe you can help us with a couple of them here and we'll get that going and either keep with those or return to some of what we've got already. You're on mute, Ellen.
Okay, I should be off now.
There you go.
Let me give you a couple, and then there are many more beyond that. So you already asked the question about what happens when there's a key leadership change. There was and so you've discussed that. There was a follow-up question which said, what important first steps can a new CEO take when taking over from a CEO who didn't, obviously the new CEO did not nurture the existing culture. Now this, of course, assumes that we've got a culture you want to stay with. So that's question one, which is important. Two, are there key cultural data points which have the biggest impact on corporate employees? Three, which is going to be a combination of two questions. There was a question about the whiplash between the last few presidential administrations, back and forth and back and forth. And how does resilience handle related to that? I would put the question, many companies have embraced DEI with current executive orders to dismantle DEI programs. What are you seeing? So let me leave you with those, and then there are more.
Great. So
Good
we're having a
job,
3-hour
audience.
panel.
How much time
Good
do we
job,
have?
audience. We're gonna start because there's a lot there. We could take the rest of the time, but great job. So I think the first one, let's start with the first one, which are, you got a new CEO, obviously they're in, first 100 days. What are some of the things that important first steps they can take, particularly if you've got a culture that you don't see as good and you're trying to change the culture, or even maybe if you have an example about sustaining the culture and even improving on it. So anybody want to jump in on that one to start?
Well, I think, Joe, you said this a few questions ago. The dominant figure in any organization is the CEO in setting the culture. So whether they set a good culture or bad culture, the predecessor CEO set a culture. So, and in my experience, every new incoming CEO has some idea about what they want to retain, but also what they feel. The good ones tend to look at history and say, I want to retain what's really good in history and refresh it for the new market and marketplace conditions. Generally speaking, when I've interacted both in boards and in my previous career with new CEOs, there are 3 or 4 things that are just incredibly important to do. One is to be relentless in the stump speech about what you believe is important, and you're going to say it 1,000 times. In the first 3 months of, this is what we're about as a company. This is how we're going to achieve it. This is why you're important as employees. This is why it's the whatever their elevator speech is for what they're trying to do as a company. Then the first few visual acts they make, the first big strategic investments, hiring decisions, all that sort of thing, set the tone for how they are going to manage the organization. Any of those have read Alan Mullally's book years ago about turning around Ford. He tells an iconic story of that he would, in the midst of Ford's going into $13 billion of bankruptcy, he would have management team meetings where everyone reported their red, yellow, green, as everything was green. And so he finally got someone to report something that was red, and in the next meeting, he made that person come sit next to him. And I remember talking to Alan about this, and he said, I couldn't figure out how to get a culture that was willing to say everything's fine, but we're working our way into bankruptcy. And so, and so those are the kinds of visible things CEOs do early on to say, we're going to manage the place differently.
I love those that imperative around those first acts and your organization structure, as you say, your hiring. The steps you take are absolutely going to be the ones that will set the stage for what follows. And so, sort of absolutely essential. To the first point you made, Steve, which is even if the culture was crap, you know what, there's goodness in there. We got to where we are, there are elements on it. So ensuring, and again, it's about calling it out, acknowledging and trying to bring forward the best of, while you at the same time pivot or shift the culture through some of the steps that you've taken, I think is sort of absolutely essential. Just dumping a culture and believing for a moment you're going to replace it with a new one, I think is a fool's errand. And that really then, in some ways, comes back to sort of the high level and often tension-filled elements of leadership in times of change and in cultural change, the need to be decisive and the clarity that comes with decisiveness, but underlying that is a level of patience. You don't change culture overnight. And so, you know, the persistence, the acts that Steve has spoken about that are decisive and clarifying to all around, but let's understand that's just the beginning. And how do you make sure you've built in enough time to really do the hard work to ensure that ultimately you continue to evolve and work down through the organization over a period of time? And there's often a real tension in those two.
Yeah, I think you guys have really nailed it. But I think reaching back to the positives is a great place to start, even if they're aspirational, by the way, even if they haven't been executed on. But hey, these are the positives about who we are, and this, that sets the tone about where you're going, and then adding what are you adding to that. But I also think it's really important to communicate the why, and this is why we're doing it, because it will help our customers. We're doing this because of our shareholders. We're doing this to be better support the communities that we live and work in. I think the why is incredibly important toward driving that change. And it may take a long time, but at least people understand this is why we're doing this. This is why this is important. And I think that helps to build a stronger culture when you describe it that way.
And perhaps just, a final element there is, of course, the board's role in supporting a new CEO, particularly in those first 100 days, and particularly if they're a first-time CEO. And how do we as a board and as directors or as chairs support that CEO? And certainly the CEO needs to hear from the board that the cultural change or the direction or otherwise is important. And so we need to create the space to hear about progress and to hear about those points of view. We need to ensure that we're there to coach, mentor, or otherwise, to make sure that there's not too much ditching of the past and only about the future, but that's right balance. So in all that we've said, the role of the board during that critical transition cannot be overestimated.
I think it's important that board members really ask that question. What are you thinking about culture? What are you going to do, CEO? What's the culture you're trying to drive? What specifically are you going to do to drive the culture that you want? I think that's a really important thing to have a conversation about, not just one-on-one, but for the full board.
And that's a particularly true. Jill was talking earlier about M&A, especially if it's a material M&A. If you aren't regularly as a board engaging with what is the new culture? Because a lot of times in the post M&A period, in my experience, you'll have there's the old people and the new people. People refer to their old companies. They'll refer to different processes that existed. And so you tend to have a much more aggressive view of, especially if that CEO's come as part of the transaction. There are all sorts of ways that this could happen, and what that CEO is having to do is create build on the old, but create a new culture for the conditions that they're going to be facing as they move forward.
I noticed the question that came in. I left out colleagues or employees in my who to communicate with. So just for completeness, absolutely employees. I should have started with colleagues.
So Fred, let's start there. And I probably won't go around on this one because I do want to get to this whiplash question because I think it's a really good one. But employees, so are there certain things in your experience that resonate more as you're making a cultural change, as to Steve's, you're putting out the messaging, strong messaging. Are there particular things you think resound more with employees? What are they looking for? What are they listening for?
I have a view that all of us are listening for what's in it for me. How is this? No, I mean, at the end of the day.
100%.
How is this going to impact me? And I think that it has to be a very specific message around, hey, we're going to do these things and it's going to be a better world for you as a colleague or you as an employee of this organization. And I think that's a super important way to think about how you're trying to drive cultural change. And I think there's lots of reasons that it can be good for employees, right? It's good because be great for employees because we have an amazing mission and we really want to satisfy our customers. It'd be great for employees because we're going to grow the business more and that's going to drive security for me as an employee. There's lots of different reasons. I love technology and we got a lot of tech people here and we're going to invest more in technology. It's going to be awesome. So there's lots of reasons that can be good for employees, but I think you have to actually say it and because I think people are listening to that.
Yeah, and I wanted to, Fred, you said something before too that I want to make sure gets an extra call out too, which is the intentional discussion at the board level of culture, which it's, there's a lot of things that are inferred and you sense and you think and maybe you talk about in executive session, but it's intentional. We're going to get to that because I want to talk to you about board and its committees in that regard. But I want to deal with this question, which I kind of inferred to in the opening about people and their values and how they're going back and forth with new administrations. But I think the question was about resilience because it was about DEI specifically, but it was about those that have invested or come out with statements and now it's not in vogue. And so they've come out. Is there any statements you would make relative to resilience specifically when that occurs, about how a company might think about its core values, what it stands for versus kind of shifting in the wind, if you will. So any thoughts on that one?
Well, I do think we've been in a period. So obviously we have had this whiplash, particularly in the last 3 administrations now, and just entering this third, where we have had a lot of back and forth on what you would think broadly as social issues. I think what's interesting, Fred was making this point of what's in it for me, that the organization at the end of the day, the people in the organization, the reason I laughed is for years I've done when you reduce it all to what's in it for me. And one of the things that's very difficult in the current corporate environment is actually the workplaces for a lot of good benefits are diverse in every sense of the word. And so in any large organization on any particular issue, you're going to have diverse points of view inside your organization about what it means for them personally, what it means broadly, what they aspire for the company to do. So I think we were already in the process now, and I think we're seeing more of it, of companies saying, I'm going to speak out on things that are really relevant to me and my business. And you're going to see less and less speaking out on things that are either tangentially there or really not related to the business, largely because no matter what they say, they're going to be alienating someone. So I think you're going to find, say, if I'm in the people business, that the people, like when I was on the board of a large consulting company, we needed immigrant workforces. We needed people to have access to healthcare. We needed all sorts of things. So those are the issues that the company decided to talk about. But it didn't talk about other issues because, in an organization of hundreds of thousands of people, you're going to have diverse opinions on everything. And I think what companies have to decide is what really matters to me. How do I believe about diversity in my population and its value one way or the other? But what do I believe about certain rights? And they're going to have to, and then they're going to have to be willing to ride the tide of the swings of this because they're going to be evaluated by their customers, their employees, their investors, and whether they're sticking to their principles or not.
I think I would build on that. It's a tricky one, and I'll admit we haven't yet been through a cycle of board meetings to hear how the board discussion is changing literally over the last weeks, not just the 3 administrations, but in many ways. So I'm going to take the high ground, which says that an organization that has a strong culture may ditch the acronym DEI, but actually now it's got to really look inside itself to say what really still matters. And for, I hope, most or many of the companies that we work for, diversity absolutely is valued, not because it's going to score a point with an institution or an investor, but because it is what makes companies great. It is a risk not to have it. inclusion absolutely is a value. I think equity is probably the most controversial. And so, what I hope comes out of this is we may, some or all of us, ditch the title, but it will allow us then to really, really focus on what matters, to your point, Steve. And I think that, that can be good. It's not, I did want us to be at this point, but given we're here, we don't ditch what made us great, and and diversity and inclusion in particular, I think, are absolutely essential, personally essential values. How do we make them live on? I think becomes the question.
I think there's a lot of real.
Oh, go ahead, please.
No, I was just going to say, I think there's a lot of realization in here too of why we did it in the first place.
Exactly.
Right? And what are the real impacts, and what can we prove, and why do we continue to do this? So I'm sorry, Fred, you were going to.
Oh, that's exactly where I was gonna get to. But I think Steve mentioned, but you start with the values. In times of, if we stick to our values, no matter what the administration is or what the winds are, we have these values as companies, and we can always stand on our values and say these are our values. And if you work here and you believe in these values, and it's great. If you get to choose, if you don't believe in these values, we're not going to change our values. I think that's super important for companies to start there. But then I go to the next point that you just made around why. Why are we doing this? Why is D&I important to us? And in my humble opinion, is so that we get the best talent. Because
right.
Definition of the best talent is diverse. If we're all from the same exact experience, we probably don't have the best talent. That's just the reality of it. And so we are committed to going to get the best talent, whether we call it diversity or not. We're committed to finding the very best talent. And from an inclusion standpoint, we want everybody to be their very best self every single day. Not just have the best talent, but you should be able to bring your unique perspective, which is what makes you great, is when you can live in your unique perspective. And oh, by the way, equity is not, in my mind, it's not controversial, because, hey, everybody's got an equal opportunity to be successful here. To me, that's it. And that is the why. You have to communicate that over and over and over again, using whatever terms are legal and whatever terms make sense for your company. So I think that's where you have to start. And then I would just end with, we talked about this earlier around resilience. You do have to be adaptable. We do have, things moving. You have to be able to adapt, but also stay true to your values. And I think that allows you to thrive. So that's how I think about the current environment. And I'm sure we'll have, more surprises and more conversations around this over the next period of time. But I think it is important as board members that we don't run for the hills.
Yeah.
That we actually say, well, we ask that question, well, wait a minute, why did you, and if we are changing something, why are we changing this? Help me understand why we're changing it, and what are we trying to accomplish by the changes that we're making? And they should move us back toward our values and to the positive results that we're expecting from these things.
Yeah, I mean, I must say I'm seeing this in the energy industry. I'm seeing it in environmental policies, and asking the question of, I understand, but this administration feels differently about things, but why are we doing it in this first place? Do we believe in what we were doing? The answer is yes. Yeah. So Ellen, I want to go into, the board and its committees and how we kind of dig in a little bit deeper on culture, but I've seen tons of questions come in just as we've been answering the first couple. Is there anything you want to put out there right now? Maybe another question for this group
I
or
think
category?
I think you can go on, and then I've got a few to come up with, in a few minutes.
Okay.
I've got a few.
That's great. So I appreciate the audience and how active you guys have been. So Fred, you talked about, being intentional, right? And I think I read those in your words, but it's like, we can be intentional about culture in the boardroom and talk about it specifically. Do we know what our culture is? Do we know what we want to change in our culture? Do we know what's really strong, et cetera, et cetera? But another way we can think about this is through the committees. And I have a group here who has chaired a bunch of different committees, been on different committees, and there's certainly a lens. And I always think about the committees or the work behind what the board ends up doing at the board level. And so let me start with, maybe Jill, I'm going to start with you, and pick any committee you want. I mean, but if you're saying, like, how can we really get, as a board, how can we get a deeper peer into the culture? What are ways that any particular committee, you want to do comp, you want to do nom-gov, but what are ways that committee sees elements of this and can check it in terms of, is it what it needs to be?
First of all, I think it's a yes, and the board needs to talk about it. The committees absolutely need to look at it. And by very definition, culture, as we've spent the last hour talking about, is complex. It's not one thing. There's not a single score. There's not a single place you pop it, and lo and behold, you get to measure it. So it's a yes, and in terms of all of the committees, it oftentimes substantially resides in the comp committee or the human capital committee because it's deemed to be about people. And I think it's a mistake to keep it only in that committee. But I think that can be the place where, to your point, that's where the work gets done, and the multiple different sources of insight. And so where there is turnover, whether it is your employee surveys, and hopefully the companies we work with are doing pulse surveys, not the big one-time annual survey, but you're getting sort of immediate response. And the comp committee oftentimes has more time to not just see and hear the report out, but then double click and to understand why there are pockets where either by dint of the leadership or by dint of whatever it might be, you're getting different results. So it oftentimes falls exclusively there. I think that's a mistake, but the role of the comp or the human capital committee is absolutely essential to do. I think, as Fred, you said, to keep probing, asking the why. Why is this changing, or why isn't it changing? Just as important.
I just want to bring out one thing you said that really, really, really resounds with me. You can see these survey results and they look pretty good, but they're an average, right? They're an average. And to ask the question, but what are some of the, the bounds of that? And if there's a bound, either good or to the negative, why is that? And really understand that, I think, is an important thing.
And to follow it through full circle, to make sure that you're going back to ask about what are the steps being taken, and to the extent to which you've got differences on departments or divisions or otherwise, how is that then rolling into coaching, performance measures and otherwise, that full cycle versus just that average single point of view, as you said, that is not going to reveal very much at all.
So Steve, I'm going to go to you and I'm going to ask you about NACDNE specifically.
Yeah, so first of all, I agree with Jill that it sits in the committees and it has to come back to the board. I think NACDNE's purchase on this, in my experience, has got a couple of very specific things from the various NACDNE committees I've chaired over the years. So one is just literally the selection of the board members. The process, the composition of the board tells you a lot about is the company living its values? Is it supporting diversity in thought and experience in ways that are reinforcing where the company's going? I saw one of the questions in the chat. Does the board self-evaluate on its culture, on the individual performance of the people? Like, is its culture reflective of the culture that the company is supposed to be manifesting? And then ultimately, the NACDNE committee is where it's supposed to be looking across all these committees and saying, are we covering all the things we're supposed to cover? Right. So so in some senses, the NACDNE is responsible for, is the comp and talent committee really, are we creating incentive plans that are consistent with the goals we have as an organization? Are we having the engagement survey reviews with the frequency they're supposed to? Is the audit committee paying attention to the compliance component? So the NACDNE has to be a little bit of a nerve center of, if we're going to take this seriously, we have to show it in our own behavior. We have to show it in our evaluation. We have to show it in the composition. We have to encourage the committee. So one of the things that I like to do is get together with the committee chairs once a year and say, how are we feeling about all the various topics, and are we covering them all appropriately? And so, and so if we're not talking about whether culture is evolving the way we want to, then how do we amp that up, for example?
That's great. And Fred, you mentioned before, I think because of DuPont, you mentioned safety. Do you want to comment at all about?
Well, yeah, it is. I mean, it's a standing committee, so it's the environmental safety committee. So that says a lot about the culture and how important it is. But I think it's sort of like, the people comp committee. You're by definition you're talking about the culture around it and looking at the metrics and bringing in the colleagues who are responsible for that to talk about it. I think that's something that all the committees can do, is bring in more people from the management team, or asked to hear from more people from the management team to get a real sense of, how alive is the culture below maybe the senior leadership level, which is something that we've done in our safety committee. But I also just would like to bring up one other committee, because I don't think it's just in these three. I was thinking about the audit committee, and one of the experiences that we heard from our audit committee was the hotline for the ethics hotline was not being used very frequently. Based on kind of broad industry benchmarks, we weren't seeing enough use of it. We said, wait a minute, that could be a cultural issue, that culturally people are afraid to actually report things, or we're not taking it seriously, and that came out of the audit committee of all places. But so I do think there are these places where you can just really probe in and say, why is something happening here that what we've noticed, and how does that relate to the culture of the company? I think it's important for us to ask that second question as board.
Yeah, no, I totally am glad you took that on, because if there weren't any volunteers, I was going to take it on as well. But clearly you get a lot of peers there. You get peers into the culture.
And I think you also have we should also remember the opportunity the board and the chair typically leads this is it time for a new committee or a subcommittee or a working group or otherwise? And particularly we've talked about such things as sort of M&A and the integration, the post M&A.
She's still on maternity leave.
I said, I wonder if she's had a baby.
Sorry, we have somebody who's not on
in
mute.
a while.
We have somebody not on mute. Perhaps we can get people to mute.
Yeah.
And so, sometimes it's really helpful, again, because it is a statement about the board's views, the importance of it. And so whether it's an integration group, whether it's a technology or innovation working group, committee, or otherwise, can sometimes be that essential statement about we're putting our money where our mouth is. We think this is important, and culture is absolutely the wrap, or it's the glue across all of these elements. And so don't just stick with the committees you have when you're asking that essential question, Steve. And I love the idea of the chair meeting with the committee chairs, but let's also say, do we have the right ones? And is there a time for a temporary or even a new permanent committee to reflect things that may be missing?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got about, go ahead, Fred. Go ahead.
One last thing that Jill, your point just reminded me of. I think the board's actions, not just with itself, but to the rest of the organization, are also important around the culture. And I'll give you an example. One of the things that I've seen before is for the board to actually go and have a meeting at a site, at a manufacturing site, or at an R&D site, and actually, engage with colleagues. I mean, that says a lot about what the board thinks is important, and what culturally the culture that the board is thinking about and the organization is thinking about. And it's one way to just kind of really shine a light on something that really matters.
And a related point, Fred, is not having board meetings always at corporate headquarters. So moving them around geographically, going to emerging areas, oftentimes smaller geographies, and then spending time with the people in those geographies is really important.
Both as a statement about how the board sees its importance, but also I think we touched on it earlier, that those moments, the board dinners with management, the site visits, can be the most valuable insight. Forget the data and all of the other efforts, to literally get a feel for an organization, and is the organization responding in the way that management may be articulating the response. And so when you're there, speak to people, listen, really listen, to get some early cues on the culture.
Yeah, so I'm going to recommend to the Northeast chapter that the next session is about being on the board of a global company and seeing culture in different parts of the world, because it's very different and it's not all one harmonized. So anyway, for a separate session, Ellen, we've got about 10 minutes left. And so give us start with one question, and then we're going to move to key takeaways after that. So
Okay, well, there are three.
Yeah,
Barbara, there are three that sort of connect to me.
Okay.
Variations on a theme. So I will start with when potential signs of culture issues arise, how do you distinguish between the board's responsibilities versus management? Then there is a related question. These three are actually related in some way. The second one is how to measure and oversee management if culture change is causing a significant impact. And the third one, which again is connected, is, okay, you've got a founder, strong CEO, maybe he's a visionary leader, toxic environment. What are the obvious or not so obvious measures or that a board can kind of see through it, and how do they handle, especially when you've got, they're the sort of visionary in the market, or maybe they are a large owner of the company, depending on which variation you want. So I'll leave you with those three. They're all sort of connected.
So let me organize it a little bit because of the time. So the nose in, fingers out, role of the board versus management. Steve, why don't you help us with that one?
Yeah, and it almost doesn't matter. We could be having a webcast on just about any topic, and this is always the challenge. If you start to sense that things are going haywire, the board's responsibility is to ask probing questions, make sure it understands what the root causes are in the data, but ultimately management has to fix it. There's just no, so we might get insights into it's a messy post M&A, or we may probe on it. I noticed someone was talking about professional services. The big salesperson that creates a toxic team environment. Like, how do you handle those things? We can probe with the board, the management team, about how they're trying to address it. They have to address it. All we can do is say, we think it's really important to address, and we'd like you to report out about how you're doing it. But we do have fiduciary responsibility to probe.
Yeah, that's great. And on the second question, I think it was really more again about maybe some metrics, understanding impact and metrics and so forth. Fred, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think it's the metrics we talked about before, but I also believe it's the direct questions. You really do have to have those direct questions and say, hey, how is it going culturally in whatever the problem area might be? I think you want to ask that question. And also think, to Jill's point, you actually want to go and see and feel, right? You want to be able to use your sensing skills as well, on top of the traditional metrics that we talked about earlier. That's how I think about that.
And Jill, I'm going to leave the toxic environment one for you. But obviously your friends can help you out a little bit too. But just the thought there of the change, when you're presented with that.
I'll move to generic. We've all been in situations where we've had less than perfect CEOs, but that is the primary responsibility of the board, to ensure that you have the right CEO. And there can sometimes be real tension with that individual being so essential, but not perhaps not always being consistent with what you'd like to see in terms of the culture. But at the end of the day, that's the board's responsibility to work out whether you have the right leader. And right at the very beginning, I think Fred underscored that the CEO's behavior has a huge impact on culture. And at the end of the day, the board needs to hold him or her accountable. Yeah,
no, that's great. Well, you guys did it. You worked in the time. What we're going to go to next, and then I know the chapter has some announcements at the end. What we're going to go to next is a really important part. When I've been a participant or when I've been a speaker, or moderator, this is probably the most important thing, which are the three takeaways that you have. What do you want to leave this audience with? What should they learn from you on some of the things that we've talked about, but clearly creating and building this resilient culture? So anybody want to go first rather than nominating? I'm going to ask if there's a volunteer to go first.
I'm happy to go.
ahead,
I
Steve.
think as board members, making this a standing topic, because it tends to get, it's seen as really important, and everyone says the war on talent and people are really important and culture really matters, but because it's harder to measure, it is easy to let it drift. And so it really is our responsibility to say, we realize that if the culture is not healthy, we are not going to be successful. If the culture is not aligned with our mission, we're not going to be successful. And so finding ways, my big takeaway on this is we do need to be relentless as board members on this topic. And we tend to respond when there's an event, but the reality is that if it's not a consistent topic, what's paid attention to is managed to, right? So that would be my big advocacy for people as they're doing their board roles.
I'll go next. I think having the awareness that that culture is impacting everything else is an important thing for board members to think about. So just an awareness, and then put your antennas up in every session and think about how the people impacting this, which is what this whole cultural thing's about. I think being curious and asking the next question, not just accepting, okay, this makes a lot of sense. So ask the next question. Maybe two questions. Then I think in a very positive way, not in a challenging way, but in a curious way. Really trying to get to understanding of what is it really like outside of the structured engagements that you have with management. What is it really like to work there and to be a part of that team? And then I think the final thing is, when something doesn't seem right, no matter how small it is, we have an obligation to speak up and really force management to address whatever concerns we might have, and we have to do that on behalf of shareholders. So I think those are the three takeaways I would leave the team with.
I'm going to build on those. I can't add much to this core theme. Is that yes and yes, the boards, the committees, every single one of us, and that means time. That's our currency that we give and that we use, and so it needs the time and it needs the consistency. This isn't a once and done. Let's take a look at it annually. This is an every meeting. The themes. And those themes can be just as important when you're looking at a CapEx request or a proposed M&A, making sure it's in all of the dialogues and the expectations are set, that it's everywhere. Related is that we can't change a culture, but we absolutely can deflect it. We can not only identify the issues, but we really can change the path. And we do that by those consistent themes, and continually asking those questions, potentially adding new members and or capabilities. And last but by no means least is the responsibilities of the directors don't lie within that day and a half or whatever it is we have together in a room. The only way you are going to get a real sense of the organization, not just on culture, but so much else, is what happens outside the boardroom in terms of the visits, the board dinners, the time you use to engage, to really understand your organization.
We're just going to say everything the three of you have said really resounds with me. And I think I would add, and you mentioned themes, Jill, I think there's a certain sense you get as a board member, and you've got to be there a little while to kind of understand it, but certain themes, and then there's things that kind of stick out. And that's where you really have to take the extra dive. And it might be when you go out to a location, because gee, we're a safety culture. And I really didn't see that, through what I saw through the tours that we took or the practices that we have, but knowing what the outliers are and really digging deep on those, I think are important. Listen, Ellen, I'm gonna ask you the question. I was gonna do the takeaways last, but also recognize this is precious. We have a little bit of extra time. I know Beth, whoever's doing the closing, may only take 5 minutes. Do you want to try another question, or are we done
Sure.
from your? Okay.
Sure.
So
I think
so
so. There's a very interesting one that says, are you seeing trends toward distributed governance, top to bottom empowerment, or away from this, meaning more hierarchical? When you look at your companies, are there trends or themes there?
distributed. Explain that to me. Maybe the others
Are you
got it
seeing trends
better.
toward distributed governance? In other words, top to
Okay.
down empowerment. If you think about empowerment at every level versus, a much more hierarchical sort of top to bottom.
If I understand the question, governance almost has to be top down because it's our fiduciary responsibility. I do think in many organizations, you're starting to see more attempts to get more on the ground management flexibility because the people on the ground have the more specific knowledge. The more knowledge gets synthesized up, the more generalized it becomes. So you do see systems that are trying, whether it's geographic or in product markets, et cetera. But from a governance perspective, we almost have no choice but to roll it back up to something from a top-down perspective, at least from a board member's perspective. Jill or Fred, would you say it differently?
Well, I don't see it differently. I think if you weren't using the word governance, I do think there's a trend toward empowering people to make decisions, but I think the governance really is top down, at least from a board's perspective.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can add anything except to come back to the core theme that is about culture. The test of culture, is it down all the way through to the people coming in the door, the folks at the beginning of their career, or the lower level jobs, all the way through, and that therefore has to be both bottom up and top down. And so that's a complement to governance that needs to be from the top. It's toned from the top, but absolutely we need to make sure we as organizations, and the board is asking the questions as to what's happening sort of locally down at the grassroots level.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And I wondered if the questioner was talking to a little bit about the way management is thinking about governance and some of these evolving areas, as my brain was going to the way that AI governance is being done in companies now. It's involving a lot of different parts of the company, which is good because it's a pervasive issue from top to bottom, as opposed to this all has to be driven down from the CFO or the CEO, et cetera. Obviously, there's principles. But anyway, Ellen, one more for us, or are we? No? Okay. Listen, I want to thank all of you for such great insights, for your time, for your key takeaways. I learned a lot. I always do when I participate. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Beth to finish us out.
Yep.
Thank you so much to Barbara and the panelists. Big round of applause. Such expertise, such great war stories. I love Steve Jennings' story about the red, yellow, green, and what a message that sent on behalf of the new CEO and what culture he was going to set down. Those markers are really important. So we thank you all for being here. We have a number of upcoming virtual programs for the next bunch of programs. Our next event is on February 6th. It's a virtual event called Climate and Sustainability, Risks and Opportunities. On February the 18th, we have a great fireside chat with Brookings Institute economist Ben Harris, which will be moderated by our president, Kathy Minahan, who used to be the CEO of the Boston Fed. But I want to highlight two in-person programs that are going to really be marquee ones coming up as well for the chapter. On April 16th, we have an all-day program for aspiring directors. And on June 10th, we will have an all-day program as well, but for existing directors, which is this group. It is in person in Boston, so some of you may not be able to travel for that, but it is very space limited. We only take 20 to 25 experienced directors, and it is peer-to-peer, facilitated by discussions with experts throughout the day. I guarantee you that at the end of the day, your head will basically explode because we have packed so much information in that one day for you. So if there's one day that you can set aside for a intense refresher course for those of you who are sitting directors, we'd highly recommend that. So with that, we will remind everybody to take the survey. We had about 150 people here during the height of our discussion. And so we expect 150 surveys back. There's the QR code. You'll also get an email. Please fill them out. We actually really do pay attention to those surveys and use them to formulate additional programs and speakers. So with that, thank you so much for attending, and we'll see you at our next program, virtual or in person.
Thank you.